Hello, my name is Joanna Bourke, and I'm the Principal Investigator for a Wellcome Trust-funded project entitled SHAME, Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And we're based at Birkbeck, University of London. I'm really thrilled that you could join us today because I'm going to be talking to Kyllie Cripps, who's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales. And for the last couple of decades, I guess, she's been working on family violence, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse within Indigenous communities in Australia. And she has a fantastic career. Look her up on the website. I don't have time to go into all that she's done. It's really impressive. But she's won lots of research grants. She provides advice to state and federal authorities, and she's really very active in so many ways. So check her up on her website. But thanks, Kyllie, for joining us today. Really thrilled to see you. Talking all the way from Australia. Can you tell us just a little bit to start us off about your background, your education, things like that?
Thanks, Joanna. My background is I'm a Palawa woman, originally from Tasmania, and my dad's family are from the south of Tasmania, and my mum's family are from the northwest coast of Tasmania. I grew up in Tasmania and made the big move to the mainland of Melbourne when I was 18 years old, just over 18 years old. I've done most of my study. My first degree was a Bachelor of Arts in Aboriginal Affairs Administration through the University of South Australia. And while studying, I was fortunate enough to be able to do that by distance education and to work full-time in the Australian Public Service. So being able to have that work experience and work in Aboriginal education at the time and work with policy was to be able to put my education into practice at the same time as I was working and studying. So I also did my honours in Aboriginal Studies, and that was the first time that I did a study in the availability of Aboriginal sexual assault services to Indigenous women and girls in the state of Victoria. I had an interest in that area, and that was the first time I was able to do a study in that area. My PhD stemmed then. I was successful in getting a scholarship to do my PhD, and I broadened that out then to look at family violence more broadly, looking at community solutions. How do communities define and respond to family violence, both in Australia and the United States? Naively at that time, I thought, as a young Aboriginal woman, that the solution might be internationally. That as you know, we all struggle with the issue of domestic and family violence, that perhaps a country that had been colonised longer than us, that they might have some solutions that I could bring home to Australia. And yes, I was a bit naive in that regard. But equally going to America and actually seeing that we have similar problems and that we're all grappling with how to manage those problems, and that the issues that confront us are the same kind of issues around social disadvantage, around intergenerational trauma, around being supported to put together self-determined solutions. That these are things that we all struggle to be able to respond to, and so that was useful in terms of having those conversations when I came home and saying, okay, if they're having the same troubles overseas as we are here, then we need to keep up the fight, so to speak, keep on driving our solutions here at home. So yeah, from there I've gone on and done, finished my PhD. I did a postdoc in public policy and in quantitative methods. So looking at how do you use data sets to support solutions, recognising that the government is very responsive to solutions that use statistics. So I got a experience in that regard, and had an article published in the Medical Journal of Australia. And then more recently, I've been doing some work in the criminological field for a period, but more recently I got my master's in criminology just to cement that expertise. So that's my background and my education.
I mean, I'm really interested. I'm really pleased that you mentioned that, you know, a lot of your educational career, you were both working in the sector and also studying, because of course at Bourke, those are the students we specialize in, and we have a very strong department of criminology. I mean, you trained as a criminologist. I mean, what attracted you to that discipline, that field?
I think what attracted me more, I think, was to what's going on in my community. So understanding what is happening in my community and how do we respond more effectively to what is happening in my community. And so that necessitates understanding it better. So if that lens is using public health, whether that lens is using sociology, whether that lens is using criminology, or the combination of those three lenses, that's going to help us build solutions that respond effectively. It also helps us to reflect on the institutions that engage in the problems of family violence, in the problems around sexual abuse and sexual assault. So if we don't understand the institutions effectively, then we can't utilize them in a way that's going to support our communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, your commitment to making a difference within your own community, I think is absolutely crucial for, I mean, for all of us. I mean, you've done I've been reading your work. I really, really love it. I've been reading your work on media representations of Indigenous women in the context of sexual assault cases. For people who haven't read it or may not even have access to this, can you tell us something about what questions you're asking and what conclusions did you draw?
Yeah, so that's an article that's been published this year, and it stems from some work that I did as part of my master's, but also stems from some cases that I explore when I'm teaching in some of my courses. So I teach a course on Indigenous women in the law, and often when we're looking in that course in particular, we're looking at cases of how women, Indigenous women in particular, are seen by the media, how they're portrayed in the media, and how their cases traverse the legal system. And this particular article that we're talking about looks at two cases, one in Australia and one in Canada. And both of them are of two sexual homicides. And they're of women that died in 2011. And they essentially died in the same year. And the way in which they were treated by the criminal justice system is very, very similar. And what is startling for me when you look at these two cases is that at the same time as these cases are traversing the legal system, we also have global movements around sexual abuse and sexual assault. So we see that the world is stamping their feet, in response to rape in India, and rightly so. We're seeing national protests in Australia in response to another sexual homicide of another non-Indigenous woman. Yet here we have two Aboriginal women, and there is no public outcry. There's silence. Their cases didn't even, it barely touched the media at all in 2011. The cases did hit the media when the cases actually got to court, but even to get their cases to court required advocates and family members to bang on the doors of the justice system and to get people to really advocate hard to get the justice system to actually put those cases through. And that didn't have to happen in those other cases. And so there's that problem. But then when those cases actually did get to court and the way in which the media engaged with them, it really begged the question about whether these women were valued by society, right? Were they worthy victims, right? And what does a worthy victim look like? And, because the way the media portrayed them, it focused on their lifestyles. It focused on, were they good mothers? Did they have a drug and alcohol history? What kind of work were they in? All of these kind of things that didn't talk to the fact that they were victims of sexual homicide, right? That's the story that it should have been on. And so it became a story about whether they were grievable, right? We didn't dispute that the young woman that died in India was grievable, that she was a loved member of her family and a loved member of her nation. And similarly, the non-Indigenous women that have died here in Australia and we've walked the streets for them, that they were valued members of our society. So why is it when we have Aboriginal women that they're treated less? And so that's what that article engages with, is why are our women treated differently? Is it something about their race? Is it something about their class? Is it something about their sex? Or is it about how all of that collides? And how can we do better to make sure that their lives matter to all of us, irrespective of that? I used the I think it was over 200 articles to make that point in that particular article to demonstrate that, it's not a lone article that demonstrates this point. There are many articles collectively that demonstrate that these women's lives weren't valued.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerfully argued article, which is why I wanted to start with it. Just remind me, it's open access, isn't it?
I'm not 100% sure, but if you can't access it, contact me and I'll do my best to hook you up with it.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a fantastically argued piece. And I think it's a good model for how you do this kind of research. Now, I'm going to ask a really embarrassing, and I apologize in advance, naive question here. I mean, some of the people who will be listening to this podcast will be Australian. We actually have a lovely Australian community that who listen to these interviews, but a lot of us aren't. And to be honest, I really didn't know what a Koori Court was. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Can you tell us, what is this? What do they do? Is this unique to Australia?
That's a good question. So in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, Koori Courts or Indigenous justice courts or Indigenous sentencing courts, restorative justice kind of courts that have come up as a consequence of wanting to respond to the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples. And I think that's probably the tidiest way of saying it, to respond to that. Typically, there've been a response in the first instance to juveniles, recognising that there's an increasing number of Indigenous children that are getting wrapped up in the juvenile justice system, And then if we can get, if we can do a restorative justice model of getting family members, getting victims and the young offenders together, sometimes also involving police, you can achieve a process that enables the offender to understand what has occurred and the impact of what has occurred with the victim. And it can be helpful in terms of reforming behaviour. My concern in these kind of courts is that if we engage with these, if we use these kind of courts for personal kinds of crimes, so family violence, sexual offences, it may miss the power differentials that exist in these kind of relationships. And I think that we really need to reflect on the motivations for why people go to these courts. And also think about the training. There's a lot involved in being involved in these courts, right? And so we need to be thinking about, are the courts equipped to manage these kind of cases at this present time? And will they be effective in supporting both the offenders to reform, but will they also be supportive of victims in their healing process? Right? If they're entirely focused on the offenders to the exclusion of the needs of the victims, then the process is uneven and could be potentially damaging to the victim. And so that's my dilemma with them, in part. And given the sensitivities and the power and control issues that exist in these kinds of violence, this type of violence, we really need to think about the safety of all the parties that are involved in these circumstances. There's been some wonderful literature, and I'm probably not doing it a lot of justice in just this little snippet, but there is some wonderful literature out there that critiques Koori Courts and Indigenous sentencing circles. One Tory from New Zealand, for example, has done some wonderful work on these courts. He reflects that Indigenous sentencing courts, people often refer to them as being, you know, an Indigenous sentencing court, that we own that process, that it's our process. But often they forget that we actually don't own that process, that it actually is a process that is still very much owned by the criminal justice system, right? And so it might have Indigenous players sitting at the table and informing the judge on the process of sentencing. And so it's not necessarily an Indigenous-owned space, right? And so his literature in this space is a really interesting one to read and to be informed by. I found his stuff powerful and informative. And equally, some of the literature out of Canada by a number of Aboriginal women activists and academics actually critiques this really well in terms of domestic and family violence. And so their literature is really important to read, because often the literature that's written in this space reflects on the benefits for the offender and not the benefits for victims. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and really interesting reflections on Koori Courts, on restorative justice. I want to go back to say something you mentioned earlier in our discussion, where you talked about the compounding effects of being Indigenous, your gender, your sexual orientation, religion, generation, age, all those different intersectionalities, to use the term that people seem to really enjoy using, and really powerful. I mean, one of these is disability. And I'm thinking here of your work on Indigenous people with disabilities and the criminal justice system. Can you talk us through what you're arguing in that context? Because it's often something that's, along with age, particularly old age, something that's sidelined in the literature, and we're really interested in the Shame Project.
Yeah, I think we often forget what it's like to walk in the shoes of people who are different to us. And when we don't think about that, we forget what it feels like, what it is to be in those shoes. And when I was doing research for an ARC grant looking at partnerships in domestic and family violence, a good part of that research was looking at how disability is experienced and how is the disability sector involved with domestic and family violence. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, to be frank. One of my research assistants herself was deaf. And so she did a lot of interviews for me and with me, and we presented a lot of this research together. And it was a wonderful learning experience for both of us. And some of the stories that we heard as we did this research were alarming. There was the story of a young woman who had been, an Aboriginal young woman who'd been sexually assaulted, who was deaf. And as you can imagine, having been sexually assaulted, you're going to be upset. You're going to be emotional. You're going to be distraught. And she goes to the police station to get support and to get protection and to do those things, to report the issue as you would. She goes there, and because she can't communicate as anybody else can, they thought she was drunk and they locked her up. They didn't realise that she was deaf. They didn't realise that there was a communication issue, and they jumped to conclusions because she was an Aboriginal woman. That is incredibly problematic. There are also other stories of Aboriginal women who had wanted to report domestic violence, and they'd gone to their disability worker because they've had lots of experience with their disability workers. Then often their first port of call, and their disability worker says, "I don't do domestic violence." And they refer them on to the domestic violence service, and the domestic violence service says, "We can't cater for disability. We don't have the facilities or the funds to cater for your disability." And then they refer them to the Aboriginal service. But the Aboriginal service doesn't necessarily have or can't be accessible to them because their family members might be there. There might be a conflict of interest, right? And by this stage, having gone to these services, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the kids have to be picked up from school, and she needs to get home because dinner needs to be on the table and ready. Otherwise, there's going to be more problems before a partner gets home from work. So we chop off our women's abilities to get help because of their disabilities. And we don't see or understand the shoes that they're walking in, and we're not readily offering alternatives to the situations that they're in. And that is a problem, because in Indigenous communities, there's an increased number of people that have disabilities. That is quite a significant problem in Indigenous communities. And the other issue too is that we know in the literature now and in research that increasingly, because of domestic and family violence, that many of our women are having disabilities as a result. And so if you're if you have a disability, if you've got a head injury as a result of domestic and family violence, and you can't repeatedly access services because of the head injury, what's the outcome going to be in the future? Is this going to be a coronial investigation because services can't get their act together and attend to your needs? These are the kind of realities that we need to contend with and to confront. We need to picture what it's like to be in the shoes of that person in front of us. And if we can't understand them, we need to be asking ourselves, why can't we understand? Don't jump to conclusions. Find another way and investigate that. And if we feel like we're out of our depth, if we're that sergeant or that constable at the front desk and we feel like we're out of our depth, then get someone more senior. Don't just assume that someone's at the counter and that they're drunk because they can't communicate. It may well be that they're deeply traumatized by what's just happened. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kyllie. I mean, so much of your work resonates with mine. I published an article very recently in Women's History Review on disability and sexual violence, but in history. So it's open access if anyone wants to have a look at that, but that's an historical approach. But you just bring it so powerfully to the present. And what else you do that I have great interest in is you also look at perpetrators of sexual violence. I published a book a few years ago, which was called just Rape, but it is about perpetrators. But you look at Indigenous perpetrators of sexual or domestic violence. And at least from my perspective, you come up with some quite surprising conclusions. Can you share those with us? I mean, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was.
In some of my research and in some of my papers, I will reflect on what it's like to be in the shoes of those offenders, and what their needs are, and to because I think when we look at solutions, we do have to think about it, and our women and our communities have said for a very long time that we won't solve this problem by just responding to women. That we actually have to be providing a solution for women and for men and for our kids. And so it is incumbent upon us then to actually look at what are the issues for men and how do we then respond to men. And so in some of my work, that there are some reflections on men's circumstances. And what I often do in those, when I do reflect on men's circumstances, I do have a group of men that I go to, because I know that as a woman, I can't be jumping to conclusions myself. And so there are a number of men that I'll either co-author with, or that I will go to and say, I'm considering making these comments. Am I on the right track? Because I don't want to say the wrong thing or to impose on men and impose on Aboriginal men something that isn't a solution for them, or that culturally might demean them, as so often happens in the public discourse around Aboriginal men, because we know that that's not helpful to their cause. So when I talk about solutions, then it's thinking about, making sure that Aboriginal men have a space, right, to talk to each other and to talk about their issues. It's also providing, like, there's one chapter, I'm not sure if this is the one you're referring to, but there's a chapter in a mental health book that I've done that I'm particularly proud of. And that one talks to, it talks to the variety of issues and experiences of trauma that men have been exposed to. Because just as women have been exposed to trauma, our men have too. And so we have to be responsive to that. And so making sure that they have a space to to unpack what that trauma looks like. Because often, even in the non-Indigenous space, it's not trendy to allow men to talk about their trauma. And we actually have to create a space that says, you know what, it's okay and it's acceptable to talk about this trauma. And especially in the Indigenous community, where when you look at the intergenerational trauma, there's a lot of it. And we need to talk about this to enable our next generation to be safe and to be able to show them that they're loved and cared for. So we need to create that space for our men.
Yeah, I mean, anyone listening to you speaking here, it's very clear to us all that, not only does your work have this amazing breadth, but also depth. And this brings up, I think, a quite obvious question. I mean, for you personally, what are some of the challenges that you face when you're working in these very, very difficult areas?
Challenges. I think there's always, I think sometimes that when you work in this space, I was talking to a colleague recently, and they said, the challenges are that we're, the policy doesn't change quick enough, or we feel like the policy stays the same, or we're repeating policy, or something like that. My experience is that, yes, that might be a challenge, but for every challenge that there is, being out in community, sitting with families, sitting with Indigenous women, sitting with Indigenous men too, because there are some pretty amazing Indigenous men out there, and also sitting with our kids. Sitting with them and hearing their stories, hearing their resilience, hearing their strength, and being there to witness that, to support their initiatives to be safe. All of that actually means that those challenges wash away, right? Because the strength and motivation to do this work rests in that, because they're the thing that makes you get up each morning to keep doing this work. And they have to be what motivates you to keep doing this work, because you want the future to be a future that says every child is going to know that they're loved and cared for and safe, and that they're with their families, and that they know their families, and that they're culturally supported. And I think that we can provide that. That our communities and families can provide that, and that strength lies in our community solutions. We just have to keep supporting those initiatives, and hearing those initiatives. And I wish many times that I could take politicians out there to hear and be with the people that I work with in communities, because they're amazing people. The victims that I've heard and been with, they are our hope. They are our strength. They may not feel it in the moment, but they are our hope. They are our strength. They are amazing, resilient people. And we need to keep working to make them safe.
Wow, that's really powerful. I just want to conclude with one question. I'm thinking of how to phrase this, because so many of the people who I know who listen to these interviews, I mean, we have a huge variety of people who listen, but some, a good proportion, are early career scholars. and who are thinking maybe this is an area that they're interested in it, otherwise they wouldn't be watching, but maybe this is an area they themselves want to do work on. They want to change the worlds around them. It's of course emotionally and intellectually often quite difficult. So I guess just to conclude, can you say something about what advice would you give an early career scholar who's thinking, you know what, this is something I want to take part in this movement, if you like? What would you tell them?
I think for an early career researcher, it's about having a good support network. It's about, definitely having a good support network. I've been lucky, and maybe lucky is not the word for it. Maybe it's being connected. It's making sure that you're culturally connected and connected within your institution or institutions to make sure that you're supported in the field you want to go in. You need that mentorship, you need that direction, and you need the advice, and you need to be willing to hear the advice and to be guided by that. And I think they're the big things. Is, for all of the research that I've ever done, from honours right through to all of the work I've ever done, I've always had a trusted group of Aboriginal mentors and academics that have been my confidants, that have helped to support the ideas that I'm developing, and that have helped guide and support what I'm trying to achieve. So, when you're writing something and you're like, oh, I'm not sure if this is going to go down well, they're the ones that are there to hold you. And I think that's what's important in academia as an early career researcher, is having a group of people that you trust that are there to hold you. And perhaps they don't even need to be in academia. Maybe in this work that we do in the community, there are people in the community that you trust that are going to hold you. If you've got that group, that will motivate and support you through. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Look, thank you so much, Kyllie Cripps, University of New South Wales, for talking to us here at Bourke, University of London, the SHAME project. I've learned such a lot from your work. So really, really grateful that you've spent this time. It's evening there in Australia, that you spent this time talking to us. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks, Joanna. I appreciate the time. Thank you.